Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be taking a look at the conflict in Ukraine. This is something that's obviously been going on for a while now, and people are starting to kind of wonder what exactly is going on there. And you've given me some really interesting stuff to look at here. We've got an article kind of laying out Zelensky's perspective on things, and then we also have this analysis from Professor Aram Alves, and he kind of dives into, not only Zelensky, but also Putin's point of view. And even brings in Trump a little bit into the mix here. So, yeah, really fascinating stuff. I'm ready to dig in if you are.
Absolutely. It's a complicated situation. There's no easy answers here. But I think, if we can kind of tease out the motivations and the strategies of each of these players, it can really help to clarify things. What exactly is at stake here and why finding a peaceful resolution is so difficult.
Yeah, and I think a good place to start would be with Zelensky. Because, he's the one who's really in the thick of it. His country's being invaded, and he's the one who's kind of leading the resistance. And one of the things that really struck me in this article was his statement about a ceasefire. He said that a ceasefire without ironclad security guarantees would be, quote, a failure for everyone. What do you think he means by that?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember that Zelensky's not just speaking theoretically here. I mean, he's drawing on his experience from 2014, when Russia essentially broke the ceasefire agreement that was in place in eastern Ukraine.
Right. And that conflict kind of set the stage for this current invasion. Just to give everyone a quick refresher, back in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, and they started supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine. And that led to years of fighting. So Zelensky's skepticism about a ceasefire is understandable.
Absolutely. I mean, he's basically saying, we've been down this road before, and we know how it ends.
Mm-hmm.
What he's demanding now are concrete enforceable security guarantees, ideally backed by military force, not just promises.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, this time we need to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself.
Exactly. And this is where his statement about needing U.S. aid to continue fighting becomes really important.
Right. It's as if he's saying to the West, if you want peace, you need to help us achieve it. Don't just pressure us to lay down our arms.
That's a great point. And this actually connects really well with what Professor Alves was saying about Putin's motivations.
Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit. Professor Alves argues that, Putin is operating from this really long-term strategy, and that this strategy is rooted in Russia's historical anxieties and its strategic concerns.
Right. I mean, to really understand Putin's perspective, I think you have to go back to the end of the Cold War, and the subsequent expansion of NATO.
Mm-hmm.
Further and further east into what Russia traditionally considered its sphere of influence.
Right. And from Russia's point of view, that eastward expansion was a betrayal of promises that were made during the reunification of Germany. And they saw it as a direct threat to their security.
Absolutely. And, they feel like the West was essentially encroaching on their territory, even though, NATO has always maintained that it's a purely defensive alliance.
Right. But that history is really important for understanding why Putin is doing what he's doing now. I mean, he sees Ukraine potentially joining NATO as an existential threat because it would bring, what he sees as a hostile military alliance right up to Russia's doorstep.
Exactly. And I think from his perspective, Zelensky's resistance to a ceasefire is a sign that Ukraine is feeling emboldened by the West. And that kind of justifies his actions in his mind.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yeah, in a sense. And this brings us to another really important point, which is that Putin needs some kind of tangible victory to justify this whole invasion.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, he needs to be able to show something to his people, to the world, to kind of prove that this whole thing wasn't a mistake.
It's almost like he needs a win to save face.
Exactly. And it might not be the complete conquest of Ukraine that he initially envisioned, but even control over parts of eastern Ukraine would serve that purpose.
It's like he needs to be able to point to something and say, see, this was worth it.
Right. And this is where that detail about France and the UK potentially proposing a month-long truce, that becomes really interesting.
Yeah, I was curious about that. Could that be a sign that the West is shifting its strategy? Or is it just a temporary pause in the fighting?
It's tough to say for sure, but it does raise some important questions. I mean, what would a lasting peace agreement even look like? What kind of security guarantees would satisfy Zelensky and also deter Putin? And would those guarantees be acceptable to the West?
Yeah, it's a really complicated situation. We've got Zelensky who, he's been burned before, so he wants ironclad security guarantees before he'll even consider a ceasefire. And then we've got Putin who's, he's seeing all of this through the lens of history. And, he feels like Russia has been wronged in the past. And he needs some kind of win to justify this invasion. And then to make things even more complicated, we have to factor in Trump.
Right. Trump definitely adds a whole other layer of complexity here, especially with his approach to international relations, which a lot of people have described as transactional diplomacy.
Yeah, that's one of the things I find most puzzling about this whole situation. Could you explain a bit more about what transactional diplomacy actually means? Like, how does that play out in practice?
Sure. Essentially, it means that you approach foreign policy like a business deal. You're focused on immediate, tangible benefits, quid pro quo arrangements. It's less about, principles and alliances, and more about what can we get out of this.
So it's like a what's in it for me kind of approach.
Exactly. And in the context of Ukraine, we've seen this play out in several ways. I mean, Trump has repeatedly praised Putin, even calling the invasion genius and savvy.
Which is just bizarre considering that Putin, launched this unprovoked war against a sovereign nation.
Right. And those kinds of comments, they have real-world consequences. They undermine the West's united front against Russia, and they create confusion about the U.S.'s intentions. I mean, if the leader of the free world is out there praising the aggressor, it makes it really hard to rally international support for Ukraine and isolate Russia.
Yeah, it sends a really mixed message. And then there's the whole issue of U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Zelensky has been really vocal about needing continued support to fight off the invasion. But Trump's approach to this has been, well, inconsistent.
Yeah, to say the least. Sometimes he pledges unwavering support, and then other times he suggests that continued aid depends on Ukraine making concessions.
Concessions? Like what?
But one of the most controversial things he said is that the U.S. should have access to Ukraine's mineral wealth in exchange for its support.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that. Ukraine has these massive deposits of lithium, titanium, all sorts of valuable minerals.
Exactly. And so by linking U.S. support to access to those resources, Trump is basically framing the conflict in purely transactional terms. It's like he's saying, what can Ukraine give us in return for our help?
Which kind of plays right into Putin's narrative that the West isn't really concerned about democracy or Ukrainian sovereignty, but that they're just trying to exploit Ukraine for its economic gain.
Absolutely. It reduces this incredibly complex geopolitical conflict to a simple business negotiation.
Yeah.
And that has really serious implications for how the conflict is perceived and how it might ultimately be resolved.
So basically, he's taking this really morally charged situation and he's turning it into a cold, hard calculation of profit and loss.
Exactly. And it raises the question, what happens to the moral argument for supporting a democracy under attack?
Right. It gets completely lost in the shuffle. And in the end, who really benefits from this transactional approach?
Well, you could argue that Putin benefits the most. By sowing doubt about Western motives and weakening the transatlantic alliance, he's creating space for himself to maneuver and potentially achieve his strategic goals.
It's like he's playing chess and Trump is just handing him pawns.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And of course, all of this puts Zelensky in an incredibly difficult position.
He's stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. He desperately needs international support to survive. But he also has to be careful not to appear like he's being strong-armed into making concessions that would compromise Ukraine's long-term interests.
It's a tightrope walk, for sure.
It really is. And it underscores the human cost of this conflict. I mean, we're not just talking about abstract geopolitical forces here. We're talking about real people with real lives who are caught in the middle of this.
Yeah, it's easy to lose sight of that when we're talking about things like strategy and diplomacy.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that ultimately, this is about people's lives and their futures.
Well, this has been incredibly helpful in laying out the different perspectives at play.
Yeah. I think we've done a good job of kind of setting the stage.
Yeah, but I think we need to dig a little deeper, explore the potential consequences of this conflict for Ukraine, for Russia, for the whole world. But I think maybe we need to take a little break first and let all this information sink in.
Yeah, that's a good idea. This is a lot to process.
This is definitely a lot to process. We'll be right back after a short break.
One thing that really struck me about Professor Alv's analysis is this idea that Putin might be playing a long game here.
Oh, interesting. So you're saying he's willing to just kind of wait things out?
Yeah, exactly. He seems to be betting that Western support for Ukraine will eventually waver. Sanctions always have a cost for everyone involved. And public opinion, well, it can be fickle. So Putin may be calculating that the longer this drags on, the more pressure Zelensky will be under both domestically and internationally to make concessions.
It's like a war of attrition then. The side with more patience wins.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where Trump's approach becomes even more confusing. On the one hand, he's praising Putin and downplaying the whole conflict. But on the other hand, he's demanding concessions from Ukraine. It's almost like he's trying to broker a deal on Putin's behalf.
Yeah, it's sending such mixed signals, and it feels like it plays right into Putin's hands. It's like he's saying to the world, look, even the U.S. isn't fully committed to supporting Ukraine. Maybe it's time to cut a deal with me.
Exactly. And remember, those claims Trump made about Russia's casualties, that they were much lower than reported, and their economy was actually doing great.
Yeah, those were pretty wild, almost like he was trying to downplay the impact of the sanctions and make Putin look stronger.
Well, Professor Alf suggests that those remarks, whether intentional or not, they just erode the trust between Russia and the West even further. And when you're dealing with a conflict like this, trust is essential. If there's no trust, it's almost impossible to find any kind of peaceful resolution.
It's like instead of trying to put out the fire, he's just throwing more fuel on it. No wonder Putin isn't taking any of these diplomatic efforts seriously.
And we can't forget the impact this is all having on Zelensky.
Yeah.
He's trying to rally international support, but at the same time, he has to deal with this unpredictable dynamic between Trump and Putin.
Yeah, it's a high-stakes situation, and I think it really highlights the human element of all of this. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitics and forget that we're talking about real people who are making life or death decisions.
Absolutely. Professor Alves really emphasizes that, especially when he talks about Trump's desire to essentially wash his hands of the whole thing and just let Europe deal with it.
Can you imagine? That would be a huge shift in the balance of power.
It would. And it would be a dream come true for Putin. He wants nothing more than to see Europe divided and struggling to handle this on their own.
It fits perfectly with his narrative that the West is weak and unreliable.
Exactly. But on the European side, there's a growing awareness that they may have to step up, whether they like it or not.
Which is a real catch-22 for them. If they don't increase their support for Ukraine, it could embolden Russia even more. But if they do increase support, it risks escalating the conflict and maybe even drawing NATO into a direct confrontation with Russia.
That's the dilemma they're facing. It's a classic security dilemma. Any action they take to increase security could actually provoke a counter-reaction, leading to even more insecurity. It's a delicate balance.
And it's not just military strength, it's also about economic power. Professor Alves also mentioned Ukraine's mineral wealth. It's almost like a hidden treasure that everyone is trying to get their hands on.
Right, and that just adds another layer of complexity, because it raises questions about everyone's motives. Is the West really supporting Ukraine out of principle, or is it just about securing access to those resources for themselves?
That kind of cynicism plays right into Putin's hands.
It does, and it makes Zelensky's job even tougher. Now, he's not just fighting for his country's survival. He's also trying to prove that Ukraine isn't just a pawn in this game between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah, he's trying to show the world that Ukraine has agency, that they have their own interests.
Exactly. But with people like Trump making these insinuations, it's a really tough battle.
It seems like the longer this conflict goes on, the harder it's going to be to find a solution that works for everyone.
That's why it's so important to understand what each side is really thinking. What are their core interests? What are their fears? What are their red lines?
You have to understand where they're coming from if you want to find common ground.
Exactly. And we can't forget the role of misinformation and propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Both sides are using the media to shape public opinion.
It's like a whole other war is being fought online and in the news.
It is. And it makes it really hard for people to know who to trust or even what's really going on.
So we've got this complex situation with competing interests, historical baggage, and a lot of mistrust. Where do we go from here? What are the potential outcomes?
Well, Professor Alves suggests that right now everyone is playing for time. Putin's hoping the West will get tired of the whole thing. Trump is hoping that Europe will step in and take over. And Zelensky, well, he's just focused on surviving. But this waiting game has consequences. We're already seeing the economic fallout with rising energy prices and disruptions to global supply chains.
And the human cost is immeasurable. Millions of refugees, families being torn apart.
It's a tragedy.
Yeah.
And on a larger level, this conflict is damaging the international system, the institutions that were set up to prevent this kind of aggression.
So it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the future of global security.
Exactly. It's also emboldening other autocratic leaders. They're watching this and thinking, if Putin can get away with this, maybe we can too.
It's a dangerous precedent.
It is, and it raises serious questions about the future of democracy. If Ukraine, a country that's trying to align itself with the West, can be invaded and destabilized so easily, what does that mean for other democracies?
It's a chilling thought, and it really underscores Zelensky's point that without strong security guarantees, any peace agreement is meaningless.
Right. It's just a matter of time before it's broken.
And that's where the U.S. role becomes even more crucial. If the U.S. is seen as wavering or unreliable,
It creates a vacuum that someone like Putin is all too happy to fill.
feels like we're at a turning point.
We are. The choices that are made in the coming months will have a huge impact, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
What kind of world do we want to live in? One where might makes right? Or one where rules and principles still matter?
That's the question we all need to be asking ourselves.
And it's not just a question for governments and diplomats, it's a question for all of us.
It is. It's a call to action.
Yeah, we can't just sit back and watch this happen. We all have a role to play. So what can we do? What are some concrete steps we can take to make a difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's easy to feel kind of helpless when you see something like this happening, this massive conflict that feels so far away. You think, well, what can I actually do about this?
Right. That's a really common feeling. But it's important to remember that even small actions can make a difference. One of the most important things we can do is stay informed. Don't just rely on headlines or social media. Take the time to actually read in-depth reporting from reputable sources, like the ones we talked about today.
Yeah, that makes sense. The more you understand the situation, the better equipped you are to actually do something about it.
Exactly. And then once you're informed, talk to people about it. Have conversations with your friends, your family, your colleagues. Share what you're learning, challenge assumptions. Those kinds of conversations can really help to shift perspective and create a more nuanced understanding of the issue.
So it's about raising awareness, starting a dialogue. Exactly. And don't forget about your elected officials. Contact them. Let them know that you care about this issue and that you expect them to prioritize diplomacy and humanitarian aid.
Right. We have a voice and we need to use it.
We do.
Yeah.
And beyond those kind of political actions, there are also ways to help the people of Ukraine directly. Donate to humanitarian organizations that are providing aid to refugees.
Yeah, and a lot of organizations are collecting essential supplies. Things like food, clothing, medical equipment. Every little bit helps.
It really does. And, it's not just about material support either. It's also about showing solidarity with the Ukrainian people. Share their stories, amplify their voices, let them know that they're not alone.
That human connection can be so powerful.
It can. And ultimately, all of these individual actions, when they're combined, they can create a really powerful collective force for peace.
So it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that question that Professor Als posed. What happens when the clock runs out? What kind of world do we want to create? The answer to that question lies with each and every one of us.
That's a really powerful message. It's a reminder that we're not just passive observers. We can actually shape the future.
We can. It's been great talking about this with you today.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your expertise. It's really helped me understand this conflict better.
My pleasure. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative. Keep asking those tough questions. Stay engaged. And remember, even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
That's right. There's always hope. And that's what we need to hold on to. Thanks again for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.